Okay, so whilst we wait for other people, let's just get cracking with this. So what we're going to try and do is this is going to be reasonably interactive. There will be some long bits of me sort of talking to you, but also lots of opportunities for participation. So first thing I'm going to show you is what I would consider to be some quite poor definitions. So obviously, I know from Artem that most of you have already done a chunk of debating, so I'm assuming we are familiar in general with what a definition or a model is. Does anyone want to explain what a definition or a model is? Let's start picking on people. Anna, do you know what a definition or a model is?
I can answer.
Go on.
Yeah, so definition is basically your own understanding of a concrete part of the motion or the general topics discussed there.
Right, exactly. So almost all motions will have some room for interpretation. Okay, so a classic might be something like, this house would lower the voting age. Well, we probably need to, in our model and our definition, explain, well, what are we lowering it to? Are we going to let 16-year-olds vote? 14-year-olds, 12-year-olds, 10-year-olds? All of these are different debates. And so the key point of the definition is to make the motion specific. So take something very general and have a specific policy. So here's a classic motion. This house will ban zoos. By a zoo, we mean any place that has the word zoo in its name. So not wildlife parks like Ocean Park in Hong Kong. And here's another motion. This house would censor music lyrics and videos that use violent or sexual imagery. We are the government of Saudi Arabia, and we will ban all music that contains blasphemous imagery. So I'll give you 30 seconds to think. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to tell me what's wrong with these definitions. And then we'll see if we can fix them. Okay, so let's start with this first one. This was the definition we were given. Aslan, I believe you've got identified a problem with this. I can see you've written it in chat.
I can say that the problem with that resolution is just basically because it's easier to play on one side. It's not really fair. Yeah.
What is unfair about it? Because I agree with you, but let's try and be specific. What makes this unfair?
Okay, and below the resolution, by zoo we mean any place that has the World Zoo in its name. Wildlife parks like Ocean Park, they're not going to be banned, and I think it's like a one-side topic that we can discuss about.
Yeah, so that's true. And also, I'm going to assume, Aslan, do you not have a microphone? Who doesn't have a microphone, actually? Can you just type in chat if you can't speak? Because that will make it easier as well for me, actually, if I know who can and can't. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people. Okay. So what we've got then is what Aslan says first as well, which is that the problem with this definition is that it doesn't really do very much. Because, let's say I am, I don't know, St. Petersburg Zoo. If this motion came into force, if tomorrow the Russian government passed this rule and said, right, anything that has the word zoo in its name gets banned. If you were St. Petersburg Zoo, what would you do? There is a very simple solution to this impending ban.
just change the name?
Yeah, exactly. You could just change your name. We're not St. Petersburg Zoo. We're now St. Petersburg Wildlife Park. And so this definition is a bad definition because it doesn't actually fix the problem, right? Most motions are created because there is some kind of problem and the motion is trying to fix it. So in this case, this house will ban zoos. Presumably the problem is that we think zoos are in some way bad. They're bad for animals, they're bad for education, the environment, whatever it is. Zoos are bad. We will fix that problem by banning zoos. But if we have this definition, virtually nothing changes. All of the zoos will just change their names. So this definition makes the debate extremely narrow and basically pointless because any zoo could just change its name, and so there's no effect to this policy. So can anyone give me a better definition for this? Masha, can you give me a better definition for this motion?
Well, I would rather define zoo as a place where animals are kept and shown for the people for the purpose of entertainment.
Yeah.
Basically, yeah, any place that has animals under some sort of confinements, borders, stuff like that.
Yeah, so any place that confines animals for humans to view it, basically. Yeah, I think that would be fine. And so that would be good because we obviously don't want to ban, maybe we don't want to ban farms. That's a different debate. And we probably don't want to ban, if we just said something, any place that houses animals in confinement, that might run into issues of, well, are we, also like contact petting zoos, also true. But if we just said houses animals in confinement, that might also include things like pets, which we could say we want to ban pets as well, right? We could say we don't want to have people who have rabbits or who have cats that they keep indoors. But that's a slightly different debate. And we maybe also don't want to ban things like scientific research, which probably also keeps lots of animals in confinement if they're using them for experiments. Again, it's up to us. Maybe we do want to ban that as well. But if we just want to talk about zoos, then it makes more sense to do it this way. Okay, so this was our second bad definition. This house would censor music, lyrics, and videos that use violent or sexual imagery. And the definition we were given was, we are the government of Saudi Arabia, and we will ban all music that contains blasphemous imagery. So, again, take 30 seconds, have a think. What is wrong with this definition?
I have idea.
Okay, go for it.
First of all, we don't play from Saudi Arabia. We play from any simple country like Europe, USA. And secondly, blasphemous imagery. It's very hard to explain what does it mean and for what people. For one people who's religious, blasphemous one thing. For not religion people, other things is blasphemous.
Okay, spot on. I would agree entirely. So, first of all, we're not allowed to just say that we are a particular country. Okay, yeah. So the world's manual says you can't do, this is called place setting. So where you say we're only doing this in one particular country. So we can't just suddenly make this motion only about Saudi Arabia. This motion has got to be about more general countries than that. And as we were also told, the idea of blasphemous imagery, that doesn't clear it up at all. The whole point of a definition is to take something maybe a bit non-specific, a bit vague, and to then make it very specific. But we've actually done the opposite. Because as you said, saying something is blasphemous, well, what does blasphemous mean? That depends a lot. Different religions will have different opinions, all those sorts of things. So, if we were going to do this motion, obviously we'd have to say we're doing this pretty much everywhere. And I think what we'd have to do is give an explanation as to what is violent or sexual imagery. And then when we say censor, that's probably the interesting thing in this debate. What does that mean? Does that mean you can't make a song at all? We won't let you publish it? Or does it just mean we will blur the video or put those like beeps over or mute the offensive parts of the song? That's what we will need to define. So, good. Those are some examples of some not good definitions. Now, hopefully, by the end of today, we will not be doing anything like this. So, we're going to go through a few different parts of how to model debates. First concept is this, loosely termed the spirit of the motion. The idea of this is that every single debate motion has a spirit. And the spirit of the motion is the idea that somewhere in the specific words of the motion, there is a debate that is reasonably fair and is reasonably balanced. And there's an idea of what the debate is supposed to be about. So what we're suggesting here is that whatever your model is, you've got to make it within the spirit of the motion. So you're not trying to be really technical. We're not trying to be like lawyers trying to get our defendant off a charge on a technicality. That's not what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is to debate about the motion in a fair and reasonable way. This is basically sportsmanship, but for debating. So if you have a definition that relies on a sort of really tenuous or nitpicky or small definition of some of the words, that might be considered unfair. So what's an example of this? And this is a bit of an extreme one. But if the motion is, this House supports countries withdrawing from the ICC and setting up their own regional alternatives, what do we think ICC means? What do you think ICC is supposed to mean in this debate? What do you think the CA team intended for ICC to mean? Yeah, exactly, the International Criminal Court. But as you can see, ICC also stands for the International Cricket Council. Now, I don't think cricket is particularly popular in Russian or the CIS states, but I'm sure you all know what it is. So if I tried to do a whole debate about cricket, then yes, technically I am within the words of the motion, but I'm not really doing what the motion is supposed to be about. So this is a bit of an extreme example, but makes the point that whatever you try and do with your definition, try and make sure that you're within the broad scope of the motion. So with this motion, there's actually loads to define if you want to. Who's withdrawing? What do these regional alternatives look like? Are they mini ICCs? Do they have more power, less power? What are the regions? There's lots you could talk about here. So don't try and shy away from the debate and do something else. So, next thing, before we think about how to do our models better, well, what are we not allowed to do? So what are some things that you guys know of that you're not allowed to do when you're defining a motion? Anyone, just unmute yourself and shout it out or type it in the chat. What are some things that you are not allowed to do when you define emotion?
For example, to make it too general or too specific, like in the previous example with Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, so you can't make it overly specific in certain ways. Yeah. Or you can't make it really, really vague so no one knows what the debate is about. Yeah, no fence sitting. Anything else?
You can just keep the framing time and start your arguments, because you must have some base or fundament for your speech.
Yeah, you can't just not do a model at all. That would be very bad. That would be confusing. So there's a couple of, we can say them like this. So a lot of them are like this. So first of all, time set. Now this means setting your debate in a particular time. So you think about this house will ban zoos. You can't say, we think that in the 1950s, all countries should have banned zoos. You can't do a time setting. You also can't say in 2050 all countries should ban zoos, because there's no real reason you need to wait 30 years to do this. So unless otherwise specified, all debates take place in the present day. Now there might be some debates that take place in the past. So maybe you could have a debate that sort of says, like a regrets debate, where you need to talk a bit about the past. This house regrets the use of nuclear weapons by the USA in World War II. That debate will require us to talk about past. But unless otherwise specified, most debates take place in the here and the now. Place setting. You can't just say your debate takes place in one particular country or region. Now, you might be able to do broad definitions. Now, a lot of these are circuit dependent. So if you're going to Euros or to Worlds or any big competition, any big international competition, it is fine for you to say, we will do this broadly in Western liberal democracies. So, we would ban zoos, or we would lower the voting age in all Western liberal democracies. So we do it in the USA, we do it in most of Europe, we would do it in Australia, New Zealand, countries like that. You obviously don't have to defend every single country in the world, because if the motion is we should lower the voting age, it's not a very meaningful debate to have that in, say, North Korea or China, where voting isn't really a thing. Similarly, if we are doing some debate about some form of economic policy, it might make a lot more sense to talk about, let's say, for example, social security or welfare. It will make a lot more sense to talk about that in Norway, France, Germany, than it will in Ethiopia, Cambodia, Vietnam, etc. So obviously, not every single country will be exactly the same. And so what we tend to say is that this can sometimes work. However, generally, debates are assumed to take place in all functional democracies, including in the developing world. So the question, you probably can't, unless there's a good reason, you can't just arbitrarily lock out other countries. The general rule here would be that if there is like a strong prohibitive reason, so if you are debating some technical piece of legislation about how democracies function, it only makes sense to do that in democracies. if you want to do a thing about some form of economic policy, it might only make sense to do that in countries that have sort of strong existing provisions. So, for example, if you're talking about, let's say, something to do with allocation of healthcare resources in nationalized healthcare setups, it doesn't make any sense to have that debate in the USA because they don't have nationalized healthcare. So the general rule here is that your definition should try and be as broad as possible to the point where it makes sense from first principles. Now, if you think, hang on, this motion would be really good if we did it in France, but really bad if we did it in Mexico, that's not a reason you're allowed to say, oh, we're only doing this in France. It's only when there is a good, sensible reason for the debate to take place that you can set it in groups of countries. But the one thing you can't do is say we're only doing this in France, we're only doing this in South Africa, or any random country like that. Does that make more sense, Aslan? Perfect. Okay, what else can't we do? We can't unfairly narrow the debate. So making the motion about very, very small set of cases. So let me try and think of an example of this. If you had something like this house, well, I mean, you think about what we did before with our this house will ban zoos. We'll only ban things that have the word zoo in their name. That makes the debate very, very narrow. If we had a motion that was something like we would have quotas for women in parliament, and you said our quota will be there must be at least one woman in parliament, then this seems like an extremely narrow debate, because in the vast majority of countries where this is applicable, we wouldn't expect you to have to defend doing this in North Korea, and they already have women in their assembly. Likewise, China, etc., etc., etc. I don't think you could reasonably force someone to debate this in, say, Saudi Arabia, where they don't have a legislative assembly as such. So the debate doesn't really make sense anymore because it's about such a narrow case. Are there any democracies, functional democracies in the world that are relevant to this motion that have 0 women in parliament? Maybe there's a couple, but probably not so many. So you can't make the debate so narrow that it is effectively meaningless. And narrow in this sense just means you make the debate about such a tiny set of cases that there really isn't that much to talk about. Okay, so that's what we shouldn't do. Now let's think about what we should do and how we do it well. So I have this sort of 5-step plan. What I'll try and do actually is, well, this video will be uploaded somewhere afterwards, so don't feel the need to write all of this down immediately or get worried if you miss things. We're going to go through all of them one by one. But as a rule, your model should have a couple of things. It should have a precise definition of any key terms. So if there are particular words in the motion that are quite technical or are vague, you are going to provide a very precise definition. It should be sufficiently detailed. So there are no big vague, oh, we will just do this. No. You've got to be specific as to how your model will work. You've got to define thresholds. I'll explain this later. You should have, and this is by far, I think, the most important one, clear examples. Examples of things that fit within your model, things that don't fit within your model. And you should have some sensible caveats. There might be some things that don't really fit within your model that you want to not debate about. They should exist as well. So we're going to go through these things one by one. So, specific definitions, and this is the thing that everyone starts out with when they first do models. So, you've got to define specific words necessary for understanding the motion. And it's always a good job, whenever you're defining these words, not to just read out a dictionary definition of the word, but to think about, are there particular definitions you could give that would work in your favor? So, what are some definitions? Well, they might be technical. So, in a banking crisis, this house supports a bail-in rather than a bail-out. Anyone know what these two terms mean? The easy one is bailout. What is a banking bailout? It was an important piece of government policy in a lot of countries following the 2008 financial crisis. Yeah, okay, there we go. So a bailout is where governments, if you have a bank that is short of money, a bailout is where the government gives that bank a load of money. Obviously, if it's the government giving it money, that pretty much means it's coming from taxpayers. A bail-in will be saying, well, instead of the bank receiving money from outside, the bank will look at the money it already has. So banks obviously hold money from people. If I deposit 100 euros in a bank, the bank owes me 100 euros. A bail-in would be the bank saying, look, we don't have enough money to pay our debts. So instead of paying that person back their 100 euros, we'll only pay them back 90 euros. And we will take 10 euros out of that bank account to fund our banking crisis. So that's what a bail-in is. So if you got a motion like this, you would need to specify what you meant by a bail-in and what you meant by a bail-out. There might be things that are just vague. This house prefers a world where people don't fear death. We probably need to define what we mean by fear here. Death is relatively self-explanatory, and the rest of the motion is just generic motion words. This house prefers a world where. So, what does it mean to fear death? Well, this is probably something we'll talk about in a second. When we talk about in our favor, and there might be multiple meanings. So this house would ban homeschooling. Okay, there are lots of different types of homeschooling. We might need to specify. So let's go back and talk about them. So in the case of fearing death, what do we think a good definition for fear might be that helps us? Is there a way we could define the word fear in a way that is somewhat helpful to opening government?
I would say that fear is human emotion.
Okay. Yeah. So it's an emotion, being scared, paralyzed, in denial of your mortality. Yeah, all of these things are good definitions. The way I would define fear is I would say that there are many reasons a logical person can dislike something or have a dispreference for something. But fear is an over-the-top and added irrational dislike or dispreference for something. For example, when I get in the car, I put on my seatbelt, not because I fear my death, but because I know logically that putting on a seatbelt is a very sensible thing to do. Fearing death is, for example, people who refuse to go on aeroplanes, despite they know the safety record, because they're terrified that this will be the one plane that falls out of the sky. So the idea we're trying to get across here is that if you fear something, that goes over and above just thinking logically and going, I don't want this to happen. Okay? So that definition helps us a bit, because we can then say, well, of course, people will still wear seatbelts in this world because they don't want to die. They're just not afraid of dying. They're not fearful of dying. Yes, there's a hand.
We can also say that in 100% will meet the death, and which means it's not a good idea to fear about things that will happen with everyone. You just make your life sadder and depressed also in moment when you're older and older.
All right, exactly. That will be a really good argument. And you can see how that argument is made better by a good definition of fear. If we say that fear is an irrational fear of death, it's irrational, then what we can say is that people will still take reasonable precautions to not die. I'll still vaguely eat healthily, I'll go to the doctor when I'm ill, I'll get vaccinated, I will put on my seatbelt when I drive my car, but I won't be constantly afraid of my own mortality. And that will be good. Okay, and our last set of specific definitions, multiple meanings. Here, homeschooling has a few different definitions. So, in some countries, homeschooling might be that you get taught at home or outside of formal education, but you're still taught by a qualified teacher who just comes into your house to teach you. Or it might mean you're taught by your parents or someone like that, but they still have to follow some kind of curriculum. You still have to do, for example, in many countries, there are compulsory exams that you have to sit. Okay, so everyone has to do their GCSEs in England, or lots of people have to do their SATs in America. I'm sure there are similar things in your countries, or the IB. Yes, you can be taught at home, but you still have to do the exams. Or maybe homeschooling means you could be taught at home by anyone and learn anything. So there's clearly a few different definitions of what homeschooling might mean. What we would need to do is to specify exactly what we would ban. I think in this debate, I personally would just play it safe and just say we'll ban all of it. You have to be in a formal place of group education that is government approved. Simple as that. And then we don't have to get overly complicated. So, next thing on our checklist, specific methodology. So, essentially what you're doing is you're answering the question of how are you actually going to do this? And so use the classic question words as prompts. What, who, when, where, how. How being the big one. Obviously, we don't need to explain why we're going to do this, because all of that will come in our arguments later on. All we're doing now is we're explaining who is doing it, what are they doing, when are they doing it, where are they doing it, how. So here's a good way of thinking about it. Imagine the motion is happening for real, okay? And the motion is just the headline. Zoos are banned. Voting age lowered. That's your headline in your newspaper. What do you actually want to know? What are the specifics? You're suddenly reading the article text. New coronavirus restrictions. what are you reading the article to find out? Because if someone told me there are going to be some new COVID restrictions in London, which is where I live, then I would want to know, well, that's all well and good, but what are they specifically? What am I allowed to do? What am I not allowed to do? So we need to be specific. Another way of thinking about this is, let's say you are op on this motion. What does op want to know? What questions would op have so they can make their argument? Although we are trying to win the debate from Gov, we're also trying to set up a fair debate. So we don't want to be extremely vague so opposition doesn't know what's going on. So an example of this might be, let's say we are going to introduce a parenting license, for example. We might need to say what's going to be on the license, who is going to be doing the testing, so on and so forth. What must you do in order to be allowed to get this license? So we're going to say what we're doing, how we're doing it. Now, this I think is probably one of the most important things in good models, or one of the things that very often goes wrong in bad models. So, often a lot of debates only happen in certain circumstances. And so if that is the case, sometimes it will happen, sometimes it won't happen. The crucial thing to ask ourselves is, where exactly is the line? So sometimes this will be really obvious and sometimes it won't be. So different ways of defining this line. And here's a really obvious one, for example, is this House would lower the voting age. The sort of line here is the question of, well, lower it to, because presumably we're going to say babies can't vote, 18-year-olds can vote. Somewhere between being a baby and being 18, there is a line that says you now can vote. So how do we decide? Well, first thing we could do is just give a specific threshold. We will give a detailed absolute line. So in this case, we could just say the voting age is 50. We'll just give you a number, okay? So this is a good way of doing definitions because it is the clearest way to define. However, it also gives you the least wiggle room later on for dealing with tricky opposition cases. So we'll use this motion as an example. This House would give more votes to the poor. What is the sort of threshold or line we need to decide? I think there are sort of two important things that must be defined in this motion. This House would give more votes to the poor.
I can try.
Yep, go for it.
We can say that people who is poor is who earns less than $10,000 or some number of dollars or euro, or who lives in terrible houses.
So one of those is very specific, the $10,000. The other one is not so specific. They live in terrible houses. Obviously, that's very situation and context dependent. What is a terrible house? Who decides whether your house is terrible enough to count as poor? So the other one you said, $10,000, is an example of a specific threshold. But we've hit on the button, which is that here we've got to define what we mean by poor. We also probably need to define what we mean by more votes. Okay. So here's a really simple one. 2 votes for everyone below median national income. This is quite a nice one because by saying the median national income, you're doing this by country, because $10,000 $10,000 a year would make you very poor in some countries. It would also make you above the national average, reasonably well off in some countries. And so questions about absolute poverty are interesting here, because if you have a country where, say, 80-90% of the population is below $10,000 a year, if you're giving everyone 2 votes, it doesn't really change a great deal. Presumably, this matters most where you have a subset of the population that is poor, rather than giving everyone 2 votes. If we doubled every single person in the country's vote, nothing would change. So, 2 votes for everyone below the median national income is one such example of a specific threshold. We're going to give you numbers. We might, however, want to be a little bit less specific. So, one thing we can do is we can do what's called, we can defer to an external body. What we mean by this is that if we want this debate to be more about the principle of the thing than the real specifics, we can try and weasel out just a little bit. I hope that idiom translates. We will weasel out just a little bit by leaving some parts of our model up to someone else. So, let's say the motion is this. We will introduce a parenting test. We will set up a government body composed of doctors, nurses, teachers, child psychologists, etc., to determine what will be on the test. Now, here's the clever thing about this model. I'm not actually telling you what's going to be on the test. I've not said anything about the subject that this test covers. What I have said is that doctors, nurses, teachers, etc. are going to be deciding what is on this test. And so if opposition says, oh, but your test doesn't include very important thing X, we can say, well, if it's that important, probably the doctors, nurses, etc. will have put it on the test. And if they say, no, your test will have this really useless set of questions, you can say, well, if those questions are useless, probably they wouldn't have put it on the test. So the benefit here is that I am not giving you a list of topics that are on my test. What I am telling you is I'm telling you who's going to write the test. And that way, we can avoid having a debate about should the test tell us about, I don't know, how to raise an LGBTQ child. I'm not going to get stuck into that debate. I'm just going to say, these people decide what's on the test. And as long as we broadly trust these people to make good decisions, this is quite a neat definition. If I want to be even vaguer, I could give a general principle. So what I could do is I could explain in general terms what I'm trying to do with my model, give some examples, and hope the opposition case doesn't hinge on any particular things. So Our test will include things that will be important for parents to know, such as children's health, education, etc. Now, I've given some examples of things that are on the test. I've said etc., which implies there will be more things on the test. But I haven't actually gone in great detail and said exactly what will and won't be on the test. What I'm doing here is I'm saying, look, it's not worth my time as the Prime Minister to spend 30 seconds giving a really complicated definition of what is and is not on the test. I don't think it matters that much. We're just going to sort of broadly explain the principle of what's on the test, because the more important parts of this definition will probably be on things like who has to sit it, when do they have to do the test, and perhaps most importantly in this motion, what happens if you fail the test? Let's say I fail this parenting test, get pregnant anyway, what happens now? That's probably the more important part of the definition. So if I just want to gloss over this bit, then maybe I can. Fourth thing in my good model is to use examples. Liberal use of examples is probably the single best thing you can do to improve your models. And this is, I think, my favorite piece of advice in this whole thing. Use examples of both what your policy includes and what your policy excludes. Examples help so much to just convince a judge to have a broad understanding of your policy, and they are especially helpful when we're dealing with thresholds. So let's ask you guys, let's say we have this motion. This House would ban non-essential cosmetic surgery. So we need to give an example of what this policy includes. So that's an example of a non-essential cosmetic surgery. We also have to explain, give an example of what this excludes. So that will be an example of essential cosmetic surgery. So can you guys think of some examples here? What are some essential cosmetic surgeries and some non-essential ones? Yep. Yeah, so I think those are two pretty decent examples. So we would ban surgery like breast implants, lip fillers, eyelid surgery, butt enhancement, all that stuff that's non-essential, medical reasons we'd get rid of. Obviously, we would still allow things like treatment of burns victims because that is deemed medically essential. And what we can do here is what examples really help with is when we use them with our discussion of threshold. So use it with an explanation of the threshold. So the specific version of that would be for us to just create a big long list of every surgery that is allowed. Do you think that this is a worthwhile thing to do in proposition? To just give a giant long list of all the surgeries that are allowed under this model?
I think it would be very inefficient to include all possible surgeries.
Yeah, it would be wildly inefficient. And we'll probably forget some, and then opposition will be like, but what about this thing? So that's not very good. We could use principle. We could say, look, what we will do is we will have medical necessity. If it is deemed medically necessary for you to have this surgery, for example, you have suffered burns in a fire, then you will be allowed to have it. If it is deemed that there is no medical reason for you to have this surgery, you just want to have bigger breasts, then we won't let you have it. However, there is one way we can make this even better, and I think that will be by including our deferring to a body. So let's just put this on doctors. You will be allowed to have any surgery that a doctor deems a medical necessity, i.e., not having this surgery would pose some serious risk to your physical or mental well-being. For example, things like treatment of burns victims, they would still have their surgery. However, people who just wanted lip fillers or butt enhancement, we would not allow. And this works really well because one thing that might happen in this debate, and I've seen this happen before, opposition says, look, here's the problem. Sometimes people have real problems with their body image. So they look in the mirror and the person they see makes them really upset. Now, maybe, therefore, them having a nose job or a breast augmentation is something that's actually really important for their mental well-being. But if we said in our definition that, look, doctors are going to decide whether this is necessary, you can say, look, if a doctor thinks that this person needs breast enhancement, and that is the thing that is going to help them with their mental illness, then they'll get it under our motion. By saying that we'll let doctors decide, it means that for those people who really need cosmetic surgery for mental health reasons, they will get it. And those that just kind of want it because they want to look prettier or something, then they won't get it. So this is quite a clever thing to do. So use examples because it makes it so much clearer to everyone, judges and other teams in the debate, and use them in sort of collaboration with your explanation of the thresholds. Doesn't this open up another avenue of debate? Yes, this does. The problem then is that if you don't, you could probably, if they want to make this debate about doctors' incentives anyway, probably however you define it on proposition, you will have to deal with this. Or if you ignore doctors entirely and say, look, this is just about what is medically necessary, you might get a POI that says, what do you mean by medically necessary? You say, well, something that if you didn't have it would be really bad for your mental, physical well-being. And then you might get a big op about how do you decide this. So no definition is ever going to win you the debate automatically. All your definitions are doing are like closing off particular avenues of debate and maybe opening up other ones. So you're right that this probably does open up a mini debate about doctors' incentives. However, I think that debate is probably one that's easier to win on proposition, to show that broadly doctors have the best interests of their patients at heart, are not going to just randomly prescribe cosmetic surgery to people who don't need it, and equally are likely to allow cosmetic surgery for people who don't need it. Essentially, what this forces us to have a debate about is who knows best for an individual patient who wants a cosmetic surgery, who knows best whether they need it or not, themselves or their doctor. I think on proposition, it's easy for us to argue that the doctor is the better choice to decide. So you're right, this does open up another debate, but it's another debate that is probably easier for us to win on proposition than if we just give a sort of blanket ban on all non-essential surgeries. And then opposition says, look, well, if I am let's say, I don't know, let's say I have gender dysphoria and I wish to undergo a surgical transition, it is arguable about the sort of physical medical necessity of that procedure. Obviously, you can argue that it's extremely necessary from a mental health perspective, but from a physical medicine perspective, it's not necessary. Aren't we supposed to take a hard line wherever possible? I think so. I would say, in general, it is better to take a hard line than a soft line, but you don't always have to take the hardest line possible. Indeed, as we're about to go on to with our last thing about caveats, I actually think it usually makes most sense to not take the hardest line in debates. There are usually one or two things it is sensible to not debate about, or the debate can become very, very messy. Because often with these debates, there are always going to be, so let's talk about the caveats now. There are always going to be what we might call edge cases. So unless motions say things like always, all, or never in them, there are usually certain things you can exclude from your debate. And this is because, you know, there's always going to be edge cases. So this house would ban homeschooling. Opposition might try and make a case that says, look, there are some children who physically can't go to school because they need to be have severe, like round the clock medical care. They cannot be in a school. Now, that's not really in the spirit of the motion, in that I don't think that's what the homeschooling debate is supposed to be about. The homeschooling debate is clearly about those pupils who could go to a school, but they or their parents have chosen not to send them there. So you're allowed in those circumstances to caveat that out. So if you're doing this house will ban homeschooling, I think you could exclude extreme medical conditions. If there is a strong medical reason why your child cannot attend a normal school, then under those circumstances, they could be homeschooled. But for everyone else, it's completely banned. This house will extend the right to vote to all prisoners. There are many countries in the world where if you are in prison, you are not allowed to vote. Here is a motion. This house will extend the right to vote to all prisoners. I can think of at least one sensible thing to point out. A good way to think about this would be, are there any groups in society? You could do that. I think that might fall into that might be a harder sell. I think the most obvious case is people who couldn't already vote, right? So obviously, probably you're going to exclude children and you're going to exclude non-citizen prisoners, etc. Basically, anyone who would have been allowed to vote were they not in prison is now allowed to vote. So you could also do that. You could say, look, we're going to remove people who are on death row if you want to. That would probably be fine. But I think the more obvious caveat, and the point I'm trying to make with this is that you don't have to defend every single interpretation of your motion. But you can't just sort of refuse to debate large parts of the odd case. So if there is a random little edge case, like what about the kid who is allergic to sunlight and so can never leave their house? Okay, fine. They're allowed to be homeschooled. That is within the spirit of the motion. But you can't just say, oh, we will allow homeschooling for any sort of cultural or religious reason, because that would encompass far too many people. That would no longer be within the spirit of the motion. That would mean that basically anyone who wants to be homeschooled can just say, we have a religious or cultural reason to homeschool. They get homeschooled. Nothing changes. So let's have a practice. So this is what I'd like you to do. I'm going to give you a motion. I want you all to take a couple of minutes and come up with a model for this motion. This house supports the death penalty for serious crimes. So I'll start the timer. I will give you, let's say, 3 minutes to come up with a model for this motion. Okay, so let's hear some models. So, who wants to go first?
I have a question first. So for this model, we should have come up with the definition and the methodology, right?
Yes. So what does this motion mean? What are you going to do? Pretend you are the Prime Minister, you're standing up. Don't bother with signposting, don't bother with arguments. What is the model you're going to say in your speech? So let's have a volunteer. Who's going first?
I can try.
Go for it. Yeah, so Abe, go for it. We can't hear you if you're trying to speak now.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. It's breaking. Do you hear now?
Yes, yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay, as I said, first of all, we have to define what does it mean serious crimes. And I would say that serious crimes is on the level like to murder somebody and so on. And there is going to be a list of these toughest crimes that can commit. And therefore, it's going to be, it will lead people, it would motivate people to not commit that crimes, because a person will understand that there is going to be a death penalty for that.
Okay, good. One piece of advice I would give you is to try and avoid giving arguments in the definition. So you sort of explained that this will act as a deterrent. It'll make people not want to commit these crimes because there is that risk of getting the death penalty. That's more of an argument than it is part of the model. So best to leave that until later to avoid people getting confused in the model. But good model. Okay, so yeah, so we've got a definition for serious crimes, murder. Okay, who wants to go next?
I can try, but Aslan was first. If you want.
Aslan's written something. Aslan, do you want to try? We'll read Aslan's. I'll read Aslan's out because he says it might as well. Okay, so serious crimes, mostly violent crimes which outrage the morality of society, rape, murder, etc. Crimes for which your moral compass needs to be irreparably damaged for you to do. Things like embezzlement are terrible but don't meet this bar. Process of trial, incredibly high bar for the prosecution, competent attorneys, multiple appeals processes and mercy pleas, not executing minors or people who are insane. Death penalty itself will be administered as humanely as possible. Okay, this is a pretty thorough definition. So we've got some sensible caveats we won't execute minors or people who are insane. You've got a decent methodology. We'll have a high bar for the prosecution. Competent attorneys. I understand why you've said that. I think that might be contestable in terms of like how you are able to define that the attorneys will all be very, very good. Appeals processes, sensible. Mercy pleas, all very sensible. Death penalty will be administered painlessly or humanely rather. All of this makes sense. And I think your definition of serious crimes is pretty good. I think you've got a lot of really good examples of both things you would and would not include. The general principle is something that outrages the morality of society. I think that it's possibly still a tiny bit on the vague side here. Like, depends who you ask as to what outrages the morality of society. But for the most part, I would say this is a pretty thorough definition. So well done. Okay. All right. So that's Aslan's. So you can go for it.
Okay. We understand death penalty as thing that when it takes off your life and it's irreversible. And the most important thing is to say why, if we do this irreversible, it's correctly and good. We understand serious crimes as crimes when you already must be in jail forever or 30 years and much longer, plus you killed someone. We think that you can't be changed even after 20 or 30 years by early free. Methodologically, we will take your life out after full proving your crimes. We understand that serious crimes more easier to check than not serious crimes. So the main line that we can't kill you if we can't fully in 100% check and prove you guilty. That's why the moment when we kill someone unfair and he's not guilty can't be happened.
Okay, pretty good. Again, I think you've got a good definition of seriousness. So involves the death of someone. I think that's quite a clean line to put. Obviously, there are downsides to just saying it involves the death of someone, because there are crimes that might involve the death of someone but aren't super serious or aren't as serious. So, for example, manslaughter in some jurisdictions. So let's say I didn't actually intend to kill someone, but someone died as a result of something I did. I don't know, I crashed my car and I killed someone, but I wasn't sort of intending to kill anyone, that sort of thing. Might be a harder sell. But I think the general principle of something that would normally put you in prison for 20 or 30 years plus, I like the sort of way you modeled it of saying, we'll do this after they've been in prison for, a very long time. And if sort of attempts to, I guess we're talking here like parole or release or reform, have failed, then yes, maybe this will be a sensible thing to do. So yeah, that's also a fine definition. And one key takeaway here is that we've heard a few different definitions, and I think all of them are pretty good. All of them are different. There is no one correct definition for any debate, including this one. It's about thinking of how you define and making a definition that makes sense rather than trying to find the perfect correct one. Does anyone else have a definition they'd like to share? Okay, if not, then we shall move on. So, here's a sort of cheat sheet for the thing we just did. Clarify terms. What's the death penalty? We kill you. Methodology. How are we doing it? Well, probably we will do this after a court of law has decided that you are definitively guilty, after we've exhausted the appeals process, we would carry out the death penalty humanely using lethal injection. A serious crime, we would say, in principle, any crime that would normally get life in prison, we would leave it up to judges, I think is a good one. We would say we'd leave it up to judges to decide whether, in this particular case, it warrants the death penalty. We would add this as a sentencing option, like how judges currently have the option of saying, we'll give you life in prison, we'll give you 10 years, 15 years. We would just give death penalty as an extra option judges can use in circumstances where they think the crime is sufficiently sort of terrible. But we would only allow this in crimes where life imprisonment is already an option. Examples, so probably with saying things like murder might get you this, probably assault, beating someone up, embezzlement probably would not get you this. They're not sufficiently serious. Caveat, no executions of minors, no executions of people who are medically deemed unfit for trial. Okay, so the next thing, counter models. Now, this all came up in one big blob, so let's just walk through it. If I'm an opposition team, I've got two things I can do when I get a proposition model. Option one, I can just defend the status quo. Essentially, I'm saying, look, your model is bad, and it would be better if we did nothing at all. So this house would lower the voting age. Prop says we're going to lower this voting age to 15 in all national and regional elections. Option one for opposition is to say, okay, we're just not going to do that. We're going to keep doing the status quo. Okay. Option two is to provide an alternative model. This is known as a counter model or a counter prop. And what we're doing here is we're saying, look, your model is bad, and we should do something else instead. So maybe we should raise the voting age. Who knows? Not every motion requires a counter model or a counter prop. We will talk about the circumstances it makes sense to do it in a moment. But if we are doing a counter model or a counter prop, it has to follow the same rules as a normal model for proposition. So whatever our model is, we can't, in our counter model, place set or time set or unfairly narrow the debate. So, one other key point with our counter model, it must be mutually exclusive to the motion. What that means is, for those of you who do statistics, you already know what this term means, mutual exclusivity. But there can't be any parts of our counter model that the motion already suggests we do. So for example, we couldn't say if the motion was this house would lower the voting age, and proposition said we'll lower the voting age to 50. You can't on opposition say our counter model is don't lower it to 15, lower it to 60, because you are still lowering the voting age. So you are still doing the proposition debate. You're just doing it slightly differently. So you can kind of do what you want with your counter model, but it can't be doing the motion. It's got to be the opposite of the motion or something different to the motion. So the next point with counter models is this idea of fiat. Now, what we mean by fiat is the idea that it takes, in the real world, it would take some form of power to do this motion. It might be financial power. It might cost a lot of money to do our motion. It could be political power. In the real world, it will be difficult to get governments around the world to agree to do this. But we don't want our debates to become, we don't want to have a motion, this house would ban zoos, and then a bunch of the debate to be like, oh no, but I don't know, Edinburgh Zoo makes lots of money for Scotland, so Scotland will never ban zoos. We don't want that to be the debate about whether they would or would not do the motion. The debate is supposed to be, is the motion a good idea? And so in BP debating, we assume that the government teams have enough sort of magic wand debating magic to actually make the motion happen. However, in the interest of fairness, it means that opposition also have the magic debating wand. So here's an example. The motion is, this house would invest heavily in solar energy. Let's think about this. This would probably cost a lot of money, obviously, and it would require a lot of political capital to do. So, if proposition says, oh, we're going to invest $1 billion across 10 years into solar energy, opposition could suggest status quo, don't do that, or they could suggest an alternative. We should invest our $10 billion in wind power or nuclear, or maybe even non-renewables like coal or oil. It's up to opposition, however they want to do their debate. Some of those will be easier to win than others, but it is up to opposition to decide how they want to do their counterprop. However, they have the same amount of money. So what that means is that if proposition says we're going to invest $1 billion in solar energy, on opposition, you have $1 billion to play with. You can't say we will invest $1 billion in. You can't say we will invest $10 billion in wind instead, because you're magicking up an extra $9 billion that didn't exist before. Equally, when we think about mutual exclusivity, we couldn't say we will invest $1 billion in solar energy and $1 billion in wind energy, because you have invented another $1 billion and you have also sort of not been mutually exclusive. You're also propping the debate. So that's fiat. And the last thing to say about fiat is that if opening gov what we might call overprops, which is that they do more things than the motion asks them, we will lower the voting age. We'll lower the voting age. We will also significantly expand who can vote by allowing resident non-citizens to vote. That would be an extra expansion of fiat. Opposition could either say, okay, fine, we'll do that as well. We will allow resident non-citizens to vote, but just not for children. Or they can reject that and say, you don't have the fiat to do that as well. So you have two options. If opening gov uses way more fiat than they need to make the motion work, you can either say, all right, you've got a better magic wand, so do we. Or you can say, no, the motion gives you a certain amount of magic debating power. It doesn't give you this much, and reject their model. So the last thing to say about these models is to think about, well, okay, but when do we do it? When should we actually bother using a counter model? And there's a few good situations. The first is where you agree with the aim of prop, but you think it's a bad solution. So as we said before, a lot of motions are essentially saying there exists some problem in the world, we need to fix it, we will fix it using this specific solution that the motion says. Now, you might agree that there is a problem, this house would significantly invest in solar energy. Probably you agree with proposition that climate change is a problem, and you agree with them that we need to do something about it. What you disagree with them about is the question of, is solar energy the best thing to invest in? So here you would say, look, we agree with proposition that climate change is really bad. We agree that something must be done. We agree that renewable energy is the way forward. However, we think solar energy is poor, and we'll be much better off investing in wind energy. So instead, our counter model is to use all of the money that they would pour into solar energy and put it into wind energy instead. The benefit of doing this from a debating strategy point of view is that if Prime Minister has spent a couple of minutes explaining why climate change is bad, a couple of minutes explaining why government investment is crucial to the renewable energy industry, and then a couple of minutes explaining why solar is really good, that first sort of 4 or 5 minutes of their speech about why climate change is bad and why governments need to invest in renewables, you can just say, we agree with that entirely. And then you don't have to rebut it. The only bit you need to rebut is the 2 minutes on solar specifically. And so if you just give 7 minutes of wind power, then probably you're going to win. If they've got 2 minutes of solar and you've got 7 minutes of wind, then you are probably off to a good advantage after the first speeches. So if you agree with what they're trying to do, but you think their solution is a bad one, do a counter model. Next one, maybe the motion actually requires you to do several things, but you only want to do one. So, for example, this house would raise corporation tax to pay salaries for stay-at-home parents. That's actually asking them, this would be a bad motion, because it's asking proposition to do two different things. It's asking proposition to defend raising corporation tax, and it's also asking them to defend paying salaries for stay-at-home parents. Maybe on op, you think, well, raising corporation tax seems like a good idea. Using that money to pay for welfare seems like a good idea, but we don't want it to specifically go to stay-at-home parents. We'd rather to do it more generally. And so that would also be a good counterprop. We're going to raise corporation tax, but we're going to put this into general welfare budgets rather than specifically for stay-at-home parents. Or, here's another motion. This house would ban all animal testing. Now, here's the problem for proposition. Because of the word all, they've kind of got to ban all the different types of animal testing. They've got to ban animal testing for cosmetics, so testing lipstick on bunnies, but they've also got to defend banning medical scientific research, so no coronavirus vaccines being tested on animals, no Alzheimer's drugs, etc. So if they have this motion, then I think on opposition, you could say, look, we support a ban on cosmetic testing. However, we do not support a ban on medical research. Therefore, we oppose the motion. So if proposition is required to do 2 or 3 different things with their motion, and on opposition you think some of them are good, but some of them are bad, you can counterprop only doing the things you like, that you think are good, and then do a whole debate about why. And then here the advantage is you can just say, look, we agree with you, we shouldn't test lipstick on bunnies, that's really bad. However, medical research on animals is really important. Spend your whole 14 minutes as opening up on why we need medical testing on animals. Yes, question.
About motion of tax, I don't understand. When we take money from private company as government and gives this money to parents of workers because they are staying at home. Am I correct?
Yes. Yes.
And I don't understand how private companies is connected to parents of workers in this theme?
Sure. So I think what the motion is asking is that obviously private companies pay tax to the government anyway on their profits, corporation tax, and the government pays welfare to various parts of society from this and other tax money. I think basically what this motion, whoever wrote this motion initially, wanted to have a debate about whether we should pay stay-at-home parents. So if you are a housewife or a house husband and you stay at home all day to, look after the kids and cook and clean and blah, 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 should you be paid money by the government to do that? They wanted to have that debate, but they didn't want the debate to be about like, oh, but that's lots of money. Where does the money come from? So they just put in their motion this is where the money comes from. However, the problem here is that this now creates a double burden on prop. And as you say, it's not clear why these two things are inherently linked. If proposition has the power to raise corporation tax and give the government a load of extra money, it's not clear why this is the absolute best way to use this money. You could also counter prop it in a different way and say that we shouldn't. Well, we should give a salary to stay-at-home parents. However, we shouldn't do this by raising corporation tax. That would also be an acceptable counter prop. But as you say, it's not a great motion. It's not one I would set, but it serves as a good example for this slide. So the last thing to say about counter props is you've got to be careful. If you do a counter prop, it can reduce how effective your arguments are. So for example, in the animal testing one, let's say you're op and one of your arguments was going to be animal lives are not important, we don't really care about them, it doesn't matter, humans are more important. If your counter prop is that you do want to ban testing for cosmetics, well, you've maybe undermined yourself a little bit, because if animal lives aren't important, why do you support banning cosmetics? Either animal lives are important or they're not. And a good proposition team would then say, aha, you said that animal lives are not very important and that we should care more about humans. But you also said that we shouldn't test cosmetics on animals. Therefore, you have conceded that actually you do care about animals a bit and that we shouldn't necessarily cause animals suffering for human gain. So, you are inconsistent and there is a problem with your case. So just beware. The golden rule of all models, counter models and models for proposition alike, is that they are supposed to help you make your arguments. They are not separate to your arguments. You don't make a model and then make arguments and don't think about how the two interact. I would suggest it's always best to work out broadly what arguments you want to run, then write a model that helps you make those arguments. So always think about how your arguments work in tandem. Okay. So, any more questions about counter models? No. Okay. So let's go for, we've just been talking about counter models. So what we're going to do now is we're going to do another practice. So here's a motion. What I'd like you to do is come up with counter models, counter props for this motion. I'll give you a couple of minutes. And what I'll do actually, Aslan, is I will just quickly zip through preceding couple of slides for you again, whilst everyone else come up with a counter model for this motion. This house would build social housing in wealthy areas. Social housing is housing that the government builds and provides either free or very cheaply to people who can't afford to buy or rent their own housing. Okay, so there are other words for this, like sort of council housing, for example. That's what it means. Okay, so everyone, counter model, you are opposition on this motion. This house will build social housing in wealthy areas. What's your counter model going to be? Okay, so Aslan, this is what we were talking about. Basically, if you're up, you've got two options. Option one is status quo. So in this case, this house will build social housing in wealthy areas. You could just say, no, don't do it. Don't build social housing in wealthy areas. Don't build social housing. Just sort of do whatever we're doing at the moment. Or you can provide an alternative model. Actually, instead of building social housing in wealthy areas, what we should do is blah, blah, blah. So basically, this counter model, counterprop, is where instead of just defending the status quo, you think that actually you have a better solution than proposition. Now, this must be mutually exclusive, so it can't be the same as what proposition are doing. If the motion is this house would lower the voting age, and proposition's model is we'll lower it to 15, you can't counterprop, we'll lower it to 60. Because although that is different to proposition, it is not different to the motion, and you are still supporting lowering the voting age. You're just not lowering it as much as proposition. So it's still got to be an op to the motion itself. Now, the second concept with counter models is the idea of fiat. Basically, any motion in the real world requires power. Power might be financial, it might be political. We don't want the debate to become, are we able to do this? We want the debate to be, would it be a good idea if we did this? And so, for a motion like this house would invest lots of money, or this house would invest heavily in solar energy. This would cost a lot of money. This would also require a lot of political capital. So, prop has the magic debating wand to say, we've waved the magic wand, we are going to invest in this. Now let's decide whether it's a good or bad thing to do. Opposition, if making a counter model, also has a magic wand. Opposition's magic wand is exactly the same size as proposition's magic wand. So if, for example, propositions say, we are going to invest $1 billion into solar energy, opposition can put $1 billion into something else. Maybe they want to put it into wind energy, to nuclear energy. Maybe they want to do non-renewables like coal or oil. But it's up to them. Okay, so the key point here is that however much power is required by proposition, opposition can also use that power. Okay, the last thing we talked about, when should you actually do one? So, you should do a counterprop. Mostly there are two circumstances a counterprop is useful. No, because solar and wind energy are different. So the motion isn't this house would invest in renewables. It's this house would invest in solar energy. So if you on opposition want to make this debate purely a wind energy versus solar energy debate, yes, you can do it. If you're like, don't build solar panels, build wind farms everywhere, that is different, right? Because if I've got $1 billion, I could either build a load of solar panels or I could build a load of wind farms. And there are pros and cons to each one. So I'm sort of changing the debate, but it is mutually exclusive. Mutual exclusivity means that I can't do both things at the same time. So if I have $1 billion, I can't spend $1 billion on wind energy and spend $1 billion on solar energy. Does that make sense? because I've only got $1 billion. I can't spend $1 billion on two different things. If op counterprop, like we should spend $1 billion on renewable energy, then yes, that wouldn't be mutually exclusive, because prop would just say, right, but solar energies are renewable, so we're already doing that. That was a silly counter model. Okay, and then we said, so the two main cases where we would use a counter model. Yeah, so you could do that, but that's not what the motion says. The motion says invest heavily in solar energy. So proposition can say we will invest in other things as well. We will invest heavily in solar energy, but we'll also invest in other things like wind and hydroelectric, etc. Proposition can say, look, you are over investing in wind. If you're going to pick one renewable energy to heavily invest in, it should be wind. We support investing a bit in solar energy, but not heavily above and beyond that which you would invest in other things. So you can do that, right? You can do what you're suggesting, but I think the wording of the motion suggests that you should be doing solar more than you should be doing other things. And that's where there is room for op to go for it. And that's why the motion isn't just this house would invest in solar energy, because if it was, it would be really easy for prop. Because prop can just say, we'll invest in solar energy a bit. We'll also invest in lots of other things. And op then has to defend not investing in solar energy at all, which I think is harder for them to win. Yes, a hand.
What is the main difference between solar and wind energy? In my world, it's also first and second cost much money. We need many time, and it's this ecological and this ecological.
Yeah. So you'd have to basically make a bunch of quite specific arguments about the way solar energy is I don't know, you could talk about like the manufacturing process of solar panels is sometimes a bit eco-unfriendly, or that it requires certain raw materials which are not super common and are more vulnerable to like high costs if there's like a short supply of some rare earth mineral you need. Whereas wind energy, basically anyone can build anywhere. You just need a lot of generic metal and a dynamo, which pretty much any country can make. So I think what you basically be arguing is that wind power per sort of kilowatt hour of energy you can make is cheaper, would probably be my angle. But this makes the debate quite technical very quickly. So I would only do this if you knew lots. If I knew loads about wind power, I would do this. If I didn't, I wouldn't. If I didn't, I would probably say instead of investing heavily in solar energy, I would diversify and invest, instead of a big spike into one technology, I would take all of that money and I would split it between a variety of different technologies. I would invest a bunch in wind, a bunch in hydro, a bunch in solar, etc.
Yeah, for me, it's very scary thing to start debate about spending money, because it's very hard to debate with creative world where you can just say we will not have enough money for second energy if we spend all money on first energy. How we can debate about money in them where we like this when we have money not for all type of energy?
Yeah. So what proposition has to do then is explain why solar energy is so good that it doesn't matter that we don't have money for the other energy. If you think that money would be a significant issue, then on op, maybe you wouldn't say invest loads in wind. You would say, look, investing all this money in solar will pull money away from wind, coal, nuclear, etc. And that will be really bad for these other industries, and that will be bad overall. So I agree with you. And so you need to think carefully about what the best counterpart is. And then the last thing we said, Aslan, was some motions ask prop to do a couple of different things. So this house would ban all animal testing, asks them to ban animal testing for cosmetics, lipstick, shampoo, etc. It also asks them to ban animal testing for medical research purposes. And so if I was opposition on this debate, I would stand up and I'd say, we fully support banning cosmetic testing. However, we do not support banning medical research. And then spend your whole speech explaining why medical research on animals is really important. So if prop is trying to do 2 or 3 different things at once, and you think maybe one of them is good, but some of them are not good, then you can just defend them. So last thing, because we're now almost at the end. Let's get some models on this. So who's got a counter model for this debate? Who wants to offer a counter model?
I can try.
Okay. Yeah, go for it, Andre.
The first idea is that we shouldn't build social housing in wealthy areas, because when you create social housing in this place, you also must create infrastructure for poor people, like shopping center not for rich people, cheap product mall, and all of this cost much more and more money and time. More cheaper and effective to build in medium areas where live medium people of the country.
Okay, yeah. So I think that's a very good counter model. You do a little bit of the including arguments in your counter model. So they're like, oh, because it will cost loads of time and money. But I think that the general principle of we would rather invest this money in sort of more middle class or poorer areas is probably a sensible counter model here, ultimately for the reasons you suggest. Okay, we have another one. We provide subsidies to corporations, landowners to ensure cheap rent in existing areas. Yeah, so instead of building a whole bunch of brand new social housing, maybe we could just provide this money to existing landowners and corporations to subsidize rent in existing places. Yeah, and so a lot of this will be circumstance dependent. If you want to argue that, look, there are already enough houses, there are already enough places for people to live, it's just a question of the rent being too high, building a bunch of extra houses is kind of unnecessary. We just want to subsidize those existing rents, existing places, rather than spending a load more money. So yeah, that is probably a sensible thing to do. Okay, so
may I try also?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, the problem is wealthy areas are pretty heavily populated, and we come up with solutions like how we can do that. In order to build social houses, we should go for a lot of losses, and we think it's not the best choice for our as a government. First of all, what we can do. First of all, the problem is how we should gain that wealthy areas, how we should gain these buildings. We have chosen.
Oh, you cut out for a second there. I heard the first part, but you've just cut out.
Hello.
Yep. Okay, we can hear you again.
Okay. As I said, A is find area, which we should spend also a giant amount of money is to buy a property from wealthy area, and B is convert to social housing. This is really very important because in wealthy areas, it's not orientated for social housing, because in wealthy areas there is more personal use. And however, I would say that we support housing, but it would be better for us to invest in available areas. It will lead us to, we will economize money, and we can that money invest in other things that would be more beneficial than buy housing than build social housing in wealthy areas.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. And I think collectively, you've all hit upon the sort of the key op. I think in this debate is to highlight the idea that however you do this, it's just going to cost so much money to do it in wealthy areas. Land is more expensive. Buildings are more expensive. There's often less space. Even after we build all of these houses, well, what are the people who live there going to do for work, for leisure? Where are they going to buy all their food from if they only are in a neighborhood with loads of expensive, sort of high-end shops? We will need to subsidize or build facilities for people with lower incomes. All of these problems can be circumvented if we just build it in if we built it somewhere else. Nationalize the land, seize the land, distribute it to the proletariat. Yes. You could do this. I don't think you could counter-prop this if prop didn't, because this is an expansion of fiat, right? So it's one thing for the government to buy a bunch of land and build some houses on it. It's another thing entirely for the government to seize land off of people without compensation. So I think proposition maybe could do this. Proposition could say, here's our model, nationalize the land, seize it, behead the bourgeoisie, and then distribute it to the proles. But that would be something prop would have to do first, rather than op. Op can't do this model if prop hasn't already opened the land nationalization fiat up, because this requires so much more political power than the just building houses. Okay, so that's it. Thank you, everyone. I believe there will be a video or something of this somewhere on the internet eventually, so feel free to review it if you want to look back at some of the slides. Hopefully you found that useful, and hopefully you enjoy the rest of the day if you are coming to some more workshops.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. See you later.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Yes, that's the spirit, Aslan.